All right, folks, this is the last part of chapter 26. And then we'll get into 27, which is going to be eerily similar because the acid-base balance chapter has a lot to do, the electrolyte and acid-base balance chapter has a lot to do with the urinary system. So don't think you're out of it yet. You're not. All right, so this is just, now we're just going to talk about urination because we've made the urine in the renal tubules. And now we just got to get rid of it. We've got to eliminate it. So this is anatomy here, and you can see that here's the bladder in the male, and here's the male's urethra. All right, here's the bladder in the female, and here's the female urethra, and that's going to be the elimination of the urine. Here's the bladder blown up. This is called a trigone right here, this imaginary triangle, and what happens is this. You erase the trigone. Where your two ureters come in, there's the hole where the ureter enters. There's the hole where the ureter enters. And where your urethra exits, that hole where your urethra exits, it creates an imaginary, well, I don't know how imaginary it is. The triangle is imaginary. It creates this triangular portion here. And this triangular portion is not composed of the transitional epithelial cells that the rest of the bladder is. So this is called the trigone of the bladder right there. There's 3 layers of muscles here in the bladder, and collectively those 3 layers of muscles are called the detrusor muscles. Right here where the urethra opens, the detrusor muscle is thick, and that creates the internal urethral sphincter that is under involuntary control. And then we have this urogenital diaphragm. These urogenital diaphragm muscles right here, and they are thick right here, and that generates the external urethral sphincter, and those are under voluntary control. Those are skeletal muscles, whereas the internal urethral sphincter is a smooth muscle. All right, so that's the bladder. In a nutshell, that's the bladder. You can see the kidneys, the ureters, and the bladder. The ureters themselves have smooth muscles around them. The ureters themselves go through peristalsis. And you can see the detrusor muscle here. It's a histological drawing of the detrusor muscle. You can see the ureter here. Do they show you the muscle of the ureter? Yeah, they sure do. Here's the smooth muscle of the ureter. So the ureters themselves can have peristaltic waves. Okay, now micturition or urination. Micturition means urination. Just like we learned the defecation reflex, there's a urination reflex we're going to talk about. It is very, very similar, okay? So what we have here is this. We have urine filling up the bladder, and that stretches the bladder, and we have nerves right here that detect that stretch, and they fire. They go up to the spinal cord, and they come back through some parasympathetic neurons, and they just stimulate the detrusor muscle to contract. All right. So, oh, by the way, what's showing you here? Oh, that's kind of cool. I didn't realize they did that. Let me show you what they're showing you. I kind of left it off. This is the preganglionic parasympathetic fiber, which you know is relatively long. Here's the intramural ganglion. All right. It's not saying that here, but oh yeah, it is right here. Look at that. It is showing you. There's an intramural ganglion, and here's a short postganglionic fiber. So this parasympathetic neuron is causing the detrusor muscles to contract. All right. All right. Meanwhile, the external urethral sphincter is contracted, and that requires a voluntary relaxation for urination to occur. So in this local pathway right here through the parasympathetic nervous system, there's a branch off of it that goes up to the thalamus. All right, and they deliver the sensation to the thalamus, which projects it to the cerebral cortex and says, hey, I have to urinate. How do I know I have to urinate? Because my bladder stretched, my internal urethral sphincter relaxed, and my detrusor muscle is contracting. So it's giving me the sensation of urination. If you decide to voluntarily relax the external urethral sphincter, the signal gets sent down from the cerebral cortex. If convenient, it says. That's kind of funny. If convenient. Well, as you know, the more powerful that urge is, it gets to a point where you say, hey, I gotta go. But if you decide to urinate, you have to voluntarily relax the external urethral sphincter. Now, why do toddlers have to be potty trained? Because their descending cortical spinal tracts are not well developed yet. So they're not contracting. This is just like the defecation reflex, if you recall that. Their descending cortical spinal tracts are not well developed and they're not contracting their external urethral sphincter. So when their internal urethral sphincter relaxes, they urinate until they have a better developed descending cortical spinal tract and they can actually contract their external urethral sphincter. All right, that's that. That's the micturition reflex or the urination reflex.
The micturition reflex involves impulses traveling from the urinary bladder to the sacral region of the spinal cord and from the sacral region of the spinal cord back to the bladder. It is coordinated by neurons in the spinal cord and can be influenced by signals from the brain. When the urinary bladder becomes stretched, there is an increase in the frequency of action potentials carried from the bladder wall to the sacral region of the spinal cord. In response, parasympathetic neurons from the spinal cord to the bladder are activated, and this causes the smooth muscle on the bladder wall to contract. The sensory signals to the sacral region of the spinal cord also stimulate ascending pathways to the pons and cerebrum, which results in a conscious desire to urinate. If urination is not convenient at the time, the brain sends impulses down the spinal cord to inhibit the micturition reflex. Impulses carried via somatic motor neurons keep the external urinary sphincter contracted, which also prevents urination. When urination is desired, signals from the brain stimulate the micturition reflex. The brain also decreases action potentials in the somatic motor neurons to relax the external urinary sphincter.
Okay, that's the micturition reflex. And this is just mentioning what I mentioned just a few minutes ago, is that infants lack these cortical spinal pathways. They're not well developed yet, so that's why they have to be potty trained. Incontinence. This is when you have the inability to control your micturition reflex. Usually it has something to do, it can be aging, but it usually has something to do with your urethral sphincters, either your internal or external urethral sphincter. That's what it has to do with. So if your internal urethral sphincter is not under voluntary control anyway, but if your external urethral sphincter is damaged and you can't contract it, then you're going to have incontinence. And a lot of times it's not total incontinence. It could be just a small leaking. So as your bladder fills and stretches, you leak urine a little bit. It's not like you void with a real powerful stream, but throughout the day you'll leak urine, and that's also incontinence. And that's why, you know, adults sometimes have to buy Depends, the adult diapers and things like that. So that's incontinence. Some age-related changes. First of all, we damage glomeruli throughout our lifetime, and you don't even see a change in the urinalysis results in the lab until you've damaged over half of your glomeruli, half of your nephrons. But because you damage your nephrons throughout your lifetime, you have a reduction in glomerular filtration rate. That's one thing that happens as you get older. Another thing that gets older is you make less ADH receptors, so you have a reduced sensitivity to antidiuretic hormone. We just talked about the sphincter muscles in incontinence. We just talked about that. That happens as you get older. Benign prostatic hypertrophy, and of course, enlarged prostate is benign prostatic hypertrophy, and of course, prostate cancer itself can lead to urinary problems because when that prostate gland, let me show you the prostate gland. I know you know where it is because we did it in lab, but here's the prostate gland in a male, males only. When this enlarges, it constricts this urethra, the prostatic urethra right there, and that retains urine. Well, because you're retaining the urine, you have a buildup of pressure there. And what happens is when you do, you go to urinate and you might have difficulty voiding. And then when you do finally void and urinate and you get the urine to pass through the constricted prostatic urethra, then it's almost like you never stop. So normal urination, you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And when you're done, and you're not leaking or dripping all over the place. But with this benign prostatic hypertrophy, you have a hard time completely avoiding and emptying the bladder. So you think you're done and you zip up and go about your day, and you might be leaking after that. And that's a problem with benign prostatic hypertrophy. Now, the urinary system, this is just something mentioned in your book. The urinary system is part of a functional excretory system. Now, we don't have an anatomical excretory system, but this is not unprecedented how we talk about different systems being part of a functional system. For example, if we wanted to talk about a functional excretory system, we would talk about the urinary system, of course. We'd talk about the digestive system, of course, because we excrete feces. With the urinary system, we excrete urine. But our integumentary system and respiratory system are also involved because in our sweat, we actually sweat out some of these waste products that we've talked about in the urinary system. In our respiratory system, we breathe out CO2, which removes acids from our body. So we can talk about all of these as being part of this excretory system, which is functional. Now, I said it's not unprecedented. What do I mean it's not unprecedented? Well, in Bio 203, we did a chapter called the lymphatic. I forget what the chapter's called, but we talked about the lymphatic system and the immune system. And what it was anatomically it was the lymphatic system, but physiologically it was the immune system. And I mean they are combined. There's quite a bit of overlap there. But you can see that we can have an anatomical system, like the lymphatic system, and we can have a functional system or a physiological system, like the immune system. And of course, the immune system is not just the lymph tissue either. It has to do with the bone marrow where all the blood cells are made as well. So you can see that, as you probably know by now, because you've almost read the entire book, that first of all, everything's interrelated. And secondly, there's not any hard and fast line separating these systems. Okay, so that's the excretory system for you. And then here's the integrator I'm not going to read the integrator to you. There you go.